who's watching, maybe.
Well, and unfortunately, I'm just apparently inept at doing this, but technically, right now, it should be going. So, I'm going to have everything set up along with the in a couple seconds. So, unfortunately, like compared to our usual shows where we kind of jump right into it, there's going to be a little moment here where I kind of stumble around trying to get this thing actually working this week because I apparently like to make things more complicated than they should be. So, my apologies to everyone there. Yeah. Anyway,
We can't hate you more than we already do.
yeah. Well, I mean, you could. Oh, look, that live event has ended. And there it is. I see it, and it's live now. Awesome. Okay, great. Wow, that's embarrassing. So I'm just going to drop the new launch link in the chat here, um, and for anybody that still cares about this, and I'm hoping they do. Um, and then I'm going to continue on with this as if this is actually going well. All right, awesome. Anyway, well, sorry for the delayed start on this one, guys. Welcome to Deeper Than Dogma. Tonight, we are going to be talking with Francis Roy as well as some other guests here on whether or not it's necessary for a men's right movement. One of the things that I haven't really weighed in a lot on in these issues. It's just because honestly, it scares me. It really does. I don't. I think that I had a position. I thought that I would be for the feminist movement, but some of the tactics and things that I've seen come out of it has made me like, okay, well, I'm not sure if I agree with that. And then on the other side, you have the men's right activist movement, and while I understand some of the issues that they put out there, I also not quite sure whether or not I side there. I'm pretty much agnostic to both sides of this argument. But I think that a lot of that comes to the fact that it's really hard to find any type of clarification on these points online because it seems like such a honestly a toxic atmosphere with a lot of misinformation from a lot of people. So to start off, Francis, you are a men's right activist, and I guess I could just start off with just asking the basic question: is a men's right activist movement necessary? And maybe you could elaborate on why a little bit.
Okay. Well, to begin with, the men's movement in general is a response that it's the response of men living in the year 2015 globally to the legal and cultural atmosphere that we live in. The roles that we have today in society are essentially the roles that were expected of us 500 years ago, 1,000 years ago, since the beginning of time. Now, since then, our society has evolved. The women have gone through their phase where they've examined the laws and they went and checked to make sure that things are impartial. They've looked at their social roles. They've looked at their expectations. And they have made efforts to make changes where they saw necessary. In the greatest amount of cases, everything was quite justified. The modern day men's movement is essentially the same sort of thing. We're men living where once the world depended on our muscle power, it depended on our brawn, our ability to hunt, our ability to take home a paycheck. Um, these things were necessary for the survival of the family unit and the individuals within a society. We now find ourselves replaced by electricity and by petroleum. We can now communicate to thousands of people across the internet. We can drive hundreds of miles in a car, thousands of miles in an airplane. Everything is quick, easy, and fast. So what has happened over time is that the positive side of this, including things like medical technology, is that women have had many conditions improve for them. Yet, we haven't necessarily addressed the conditions of men. And what we're experiencing now is that a lot of men are looking around and they're going, well, who am I now? What do I do now? Where's my role? What are my rights? What are what are the limits as to what I'm willing to do? The men's rights movement specifically is the movement that deals with legal rights, rights under law. It is also a colloquialism to mean anyone who deals with any men's issues whatsoever. So it's important to pay attention when we say, I prefer to say somebody who's in the men's movement, and to specify somebody who is in somebody who's a men's rights activist is somebody who is active in working for legal issues for men. So I understand from time to time we'll confuse those, but it would be helpful to everybody if we could make that distinction. Now, it seemed, did you have a follow-up question?
Sorry, I'm having some issues with my sound here for a second. Oz, do you want to take over for a sec?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Francis. That was good. That was a sort of a good distinction. Um, um, yeah, it's really funny to ask about the question: is a men's rights movement necessary? I mean, the question presupposes that there's some sort of injustice, some sort of problem that needs rectification, right? Why else would you need a movement? Why would you need a kind of a movement to sort of restore secure rights or equity or justice or something for a certain group unless there was some sort of injustice and not something trivial. So I'm curious, in your view, what would be examples of legal disadvantages that you think men are laboring under um, that need rectification and need a men's movement to address?
It's not that the issues need a men's movement. It's that the men's movement came in response to legal issues. So I want to be careful that we don't start from the point of view of, well, you know, these guys were just bored and said, hey, do you know what? Let's start a men's movement. Now let's look for some issues to deal with. It's actually the other way around. Some of the issues, there are some issues that affect us at a very broad level, and there are issues that affect us at a more personal level. When we're talking about men's issues, we're talking about issues like fathers' issues, like the issues of reproductive rights, the issues of our children in school, the issues of whether men are treated impartially under law. We also talk about issues of how men are treated in culture, and a lot of what gets people involved in the men's rights movement is on the legal end. Just the average guy who lives in our culture frequently finds that when he turns on the television, the radio, when he goes to the internet, there are a lot of there's the message promoted that men are somehow defective, that we are inferior, that we are violent, that men are rapists. And on the other hand, we have a message promoted that women are great, but they're victims. They're tremendous athletes, but their opportunities are neglected because of a patriarchal system. But if you talk to the average guy will not whip out his wallet and hold out his patriarchy card. He's just a man trying to do the best that he can in society.
Could I jump in briefly? Because my main concern here is that I see sometimes a certain symmetry between the men's right activists and the women's right activists.
Mm-hmm.
So the sort of rhetoric that you were just saying here, and I think rhetoric is a bad word because it comes with negative connotations, but I can't think of another one, is the same sort of thing that you hear feminists saying as well. When they turn on the television, it's more about sexual objectification. That's the sort of key word. And without doubt, women have the short stick in some aspects of society as well. I mean, I think sexual based assault is worse for women, whereas other forms of assault are worse for men. So my concern is that the men's rights movement has the same failings that the current modern women's rights movement has. And wouldn't it be better, instead of perhaps creating this divisor between the men's rights and women's rights, that we focus more on human rights?
I appreciate that, and there's a couple things I have to say on that. One, you're absolutely right. Men have advantages. Men also have disadvantages. Women have advantages. Women also have disadvantages. It's not one or the other. It's both. Now, if women decide, if people decide, you know what really interests me? I want to make sure that my daughter is treated well. I want to make sure that my wife doesn't have to worry about a differential in paycheck. If I want to make sure that my mother, my aunt, all the people that I care for are taken care of. Therefore, I will act on behalf of women, and I will speak on behalf of women. I have absolutely no problem with that. The same thing with the men's movement. There's nothing wrong in saying, do you know what? I've decided that I'm going to take care of men. I'm interested in men's issues. I'm interested in making sure that my son gets a fair shake, that my grandson, that my nephews, that my neighbor all get a fair shake. I think that there are two classes of people. They're the people who say, we just have issues, and let's resolve them. And then there are those who insist on making it us versus them issue. Not necessary to
Hey, Francis, you're locking up.
for me to work on. It's not necessary for me to work that I'm not particularly interested in any more than it's necessary.
Yeah, I'm not sure who would...
Dichotomy isn't
Here, let me...
real.
Hey, Francis, I'm not sure if you can hear me. I'm going to mute you for just a second, but you're lagging out. I'm not sure who was speaking right before that, but if someone had a comment just on what was going on.
Okay, yeah, it looks like Francis laying out here. You might need to refresh. Mallory, from what you've heard so far, would you... Sorry, first off, do you recognize yourself as a feminist?
No.
No, you don't. Okay.
No, and I know I was kind of thrown in the mix last minute. That was my main concern, was I thought you guys might want somebody who self-identified as a feminist, and I don't. Not because I have any problems with those who do. I just don't think feminist theory accurately describes the way the world is. So I wouldn't feel right identifying that way. I have a problem with identity politics in general, which seems to be what the MRA movement is doing, as well as feminism for its part. So I think we're actually kind of just got another one of you in here.
Oh, that's fine. Okay. So one of the issues that that they come out to when they talk about the whole men's right activist movement is this concept of privilege blindness, the fact that men already have all these privileges that are out there. That why do they need a movement to begin with when the females are so underrepresented in so many areas?
Yeah, I guess I'm trying to think of what would be like the top issue where men are discriminated against, and the only thing that comes to mind that right away is just how men are treated in a situation of divorce. We often hear, the woman often gets the kids, and the man only gets limited visitation rights and so forth. I'm not sure if the laws have changed or how equal it is, but that's why I typically hear where men are generally discriminated against is during a divorce. But I'm not sure if that's
I know that
over the years.
Cite things like the existence of compulsory draft type stuff, having to sign up for selective service. What else do they cite? I'm trying to think. I mean, I don't know if they argue this very frequently, but there are body integrity problems. Circumcision in America is a huge problem that I've heard people argue that the fact that we do that is evidence that we don't view their bodies as their own. And I think they can probably make a good case there. I just don't know why it needs a gender-specific activist thing. That body integrity issues are everybody issues. I think that's pretty obvious. And you can make a better philosophic argument if you don't segregate by gender.
So that brings up like one of the main concerns I have is that there are these human issues that do apply to both sexes out there. By polarizing these positions, is anything really being accomplished? Will the extremes on either end actually accomplish anything in this discussion?
I think there is some utility in having gender-specific rights movements when the disparity is large. But it seems that when the disparity is much smaller as it is today, I mean, if there's some disparity between the genders, some advantages, some disadvantages, it's still clearly smaller than it was 100 years ago. And you could say the same about perhaps the age differences. But when it's pretty large, the machinery seems to work in people's favour. But when the difference is pretty small, the machine sort of eats itself like a Venus flytrap, testing it itself when it doesn't catch a fly. Because like if you close a Venus flytrap, but when the difference is pretty small, the machine sort of eats itself like a Venus flytrap, testing it itself when it doesn't catch a fly. Because like if you close a Venus flytrap, but when the difference is pretty small, the machine sort of eats itself like a Venus flytrap, testing it itself when it doesn't catch a fly. Because like if you close a Venus flytrap, but when the difference is pretty small, the machine sort of eats itself like.
Yes.
Yeah, Francis, we can hear you. Floyd, you were about to say something. Go ahead first, and then maybe Francis.
Yeah, I was thinking, with the men's right movement, I wonder if it could be combined with gay couples as well. If you have a male gay couple, for example, what are their rights to adopt, for example, compared to a heterosexual couple or even a lesbian couple? Would a gay male couple be discriminated against if they wanted to start a family? I would think that could be very much a case where men aren't seen as nurturers where women are, so therefore men would be less likely to adopt. So I would think perhaps the gay rights movement could as far as men could be combined with the men's right movement in general.
Sorry. One of the I find it slightly frustrating that people are responding with, no, it's not important, it's too divisive. Let's not focus on men. Why not? There's nothing wrong with focusing on men. Men have issues. Men are people. If this issue were about women, people wouldn't go, we should merge the women's issues into human issues. People would say, well, yeah, they got issues. Let's pay attention to them. I do not see any reason why it's unreasonable, especially after 50 years of serious study for the women's part, why we men should not speak as men for men. And there's no problem with that. And the fact that there's a woman's side and a man's side does not mean that, well, let's now all just merge it into humanity. No, we get to pay attention to ourselves.
Yeah, but, I mean, I acknowledge it, but I mean, it's like the rather poor analogy I made about the machine eating itself. What I think is that what you said about we wouldn't agree if the women's rights activists merged this all into the human rights activists. But that's exactly the point that I'm going for. The trouble with the female rights activists and is that they breed this toxic ideology. So, for example, the female rights activists are very against freedom freedom of speech, just to name one thing. And the men's rights activists also breed a different form of toxic ideology, and it often comes in the form of this sort of outdated traditionalism. So, for example, a men's rights activist is probably far more likely to be against gay marriage than a female rights activist, and there's no real reason for that. It's just that these two groups are breeding this toxic political ideology, and I think the reason for that is because the differences now relative to what they were 50 or 100 years ago are relatively small. So it seems more productive for both groups, and I'm not just saying this for the men's or the women's groups, to have a human rights movement or an egalitarian movement, because it seems somewhat hypocritical if we're arguing against the toxic feminist ideology to not also argue against the toxic I don't know what you would call it, traditionalist ideology on the men's rights side.
I want to challenge you on that. One, you've conflated the women's movement with feminism. They are not the same thing. Second of all, the women's rights movement, what people often refer to as the first stage, the first phase of feminism, focused on rights. We men have not done that yet. The second phase of what is called, what they call the second phase of feminism, which wasn't feminism, was about women's liberation. It was about women looking at their social roles, finding their place in society, knowing what their limits are, what they would accept, what they would not. We men have not done this yet. The third phase of the women's movement is more akin to what we call feminism. Feminism starts at its very basis with an us versus them. Women are the victims of men. This was not always the case. What feminists do today is they reach way back into the past and they say anything having to do with women, that's feminism. That's simply not true. And to say that the root of the men's movement is traditionalism is simply false. That's like saying that the root of women's rights is ecofeminism. No.
I didn't say that. I said that it breeds this sort of ideology. You very rarely get traditionalism in the sort of feminist spheres. That just doesn't happen. But what I said was that with the men's rights activists and the women's rights activists in the modern age, these two groups tend to breed extreme political ideologies, which would not have been the case 50 or so years ago in the sort of first wave feminism age, but it is in the case today. Again, it's the sort of the machinery eating itself. It's like if you've read Isaac Asimov's, it's like the war between the spacers and the terrestrialists. The spacers start off as being the privileged, the oppressors, they conquer the galaxy sort of thing, and then the terrestrialists the power balance starts to change, and then but interestingly enough, the terrestrialists become like the spacers. It's like you've got a scale and you're hitting it with a hammer. Okay, that does well for when the scale's very uneven, but when it's quite close to equilibrium, you've got to use finer machinery. And I think that in the age of today, the machinery that you're suggesting and the machinery that the feminists are suggesting is very crude, and it does more harm than good. And this can be illustrated by the fact that the women's rights movement in the Western world generates this very toxic form of feminism, and the men's rights activists. And I'm sure you're not a traditionalist, but people in the men's traditionalism is rife in the men's rights movement. That's what I'm saying.
No, I'm sorry. You're extremely misinformed on two things. The first thing is you are again mistaking the women's rights movement for feminism. Feminism is based on feminist theory. Feminist theory is the notion that there's a conflict between men and women. The first and second phases were simply women working their place out in society. Feminism started when we started adopting feminist theory as a way of diagnosing the world. And it's just not a good point of view. Now, what you're also doing, so you are conflating one part of the women's movement, of those who claim to speak for women, and you're calling it all feminism. And you're doing the same thing with traditionalism. In the men's movement in general, there are traditionalists, but they are a part and not all, and not all use traditional arguments. I certainly don't. Most you'll find acrimonious wars between the traditionalists and the rest of the men's movement, in the same way that you would find most traditionalists also happen to be religious. Not all, but a great many of them. So to conflate that one small part with the entire movement, to conflate feminism with the entire women's rights movement is simply inappropriate. You are taking two small factions, saying these two small factions resemble each other but are diametrically opposed. Therefore, both entire movements are this thing. And that's simply not true.
From what I'm picking up, just my observation on it is that he's saying that the men's movement and the women's movement are breed this other form of it, of why that's why they're a destructive element, is that they've been shown to breed this movement if they go along these lines and not take humans as a whole and actually divide it out to men and women. Was that fair, Quantum?
And what I'm pointing out is that his reasoning is inaccurate because he's using two small parts to say these two small parts breed antagonism amongst all of it. And that's simply not true. These two small parts may be at war with each other, but this does not mean movement is about conflict or is about breeding extremist nutcases.
But I mean, you have to look at why this is happening, and I'm not necessarily sure it's a small group. But let's take before women had the vote, you didn't get this feminism extremism because there was a big problem that you worked together to solve. There was this big problem that you had to work together to solve. Today, in the feminist movement, there's no big problem to solve, and the same is the case with the men's movement. There are smaller problems to solve, and the trouble is this whole activist type ideology is good for solving big problems, but when you try and apply it to small problems, what you get is you get things like these microaggressions. You get these victimhood complexes, and this is the sort of environment that breeds this sort of thing. And whether or not these factions represent the whole, they are factions that you wouldn't find as much when these problems were actually real problems. I'm not trying to say that the men's rights movement is synonymous with traditionalism in the same way I'm not trying to say that the women's rights movement is synonymous with feminism, but I am saying that in the modern day, the sort of environment, the climate that we live in, does help these groups to survive, whereas a humanist movement is a sort of finer tool that might not be as effective for giving women the vote for women's suffrage, but it seems more effective in the day where we're worrying about really minutiae and blowing them out of all proportion.
Can I interject with something? Oh, sorry, go ahead, Francis.
No,
please.
You go, Leslie. You'll probably say exactly what I want to say first.
Okay, I don't know. I think I might be taking a slightly different direction, but there's a tendency for people to say, look, why do we have to have feminism and a men's rights movement and a women's rights movement and anything like that? Why can't we just have egalitarianism, right? I mean, nominally, both a men's rights movement and a women's rights movement are striving for equality. I mean, that is their stated goals, right? So their stated objectives are the same. I mean, they shouldn't. I mean, why should they be at each other's throats, right? They shouldn't be. They should be striving for the same objectives, if that's really what they're after. But of course, the reality is that people are best able to look after their own interests, right? I don't want people looking after my own interests. I'd rather look after my own interests. It's always nice when people look after my own interests and their view of my interests comport with my view of my interests, right? But when it comes to something like children, well, children can't look after their own interests, so it's up to us grown-ups to take care of children and look after their own interests, okay? But men and women presumably are affected differently by how our society is organized, and who better than women to decide for themselves where they feel the disadvantages. I mean, obviously, if women are at a disadvantage and men are at an advantage in some particular domain, then perhaps the men will be blind to the plight of women, and women will be very alive to it, right? So of course it makes sense that women are going to band together and they are going to agitate to rectify things to serve their interests. and the same for men. So I don't think that we need to sort of poo-poo the idea of a women's rights movement and a men's rights movement, because of course people are better situated to know what their own interests are and to know what their own advantages and disadvantages are relative to another group. So this only makes sense. With respect to sort of the stridency that we find in these movements, I mean, there's a whole lot of stridency that we're seeing in feminism, and I see a whole lot of stridency in the men's movement. I mean, I spent a little bit of time on the A Voice for Men forum on the internet, and I mean, there was just some very, very shrill voices there. Now, and that I think causes people to sort of prematurely poo-poo the idea, because you can point to the shrill people, the most strident voices, and think, oh, I'm going to write off the whole movement on that basis. But I think that's premature. I think that is something that people in the men's rights movement have to be alive to, that there are these very, very shrill voices, these strident voices who overstate things, who just make up statistics, who repeat factoids, and thus discredit the movement. I think that the men's movement needs to sort of put a cap on that. And the men's movement, I think, compared to feminism, is operating under a real handicap. The men's movement has arisen fully within the context of the internet. The women's rights movement and feminism arose pre-internet. I mean, when I was an undergraduate student in university, there was a women's studies program at the university that I attended called the Simone de Beauvoir Institute. Some of the things that were said there, that went on there, that were taught there, were some of the craziest things. Just, it was so far out, so bananas. Some of the craziest theory uncoupled from fact. But it went on behind closed doors. You didn't hear about it. There were only a few people out there who were writing books about what was going on in women's studies departments. You had people like Daphne Patai writing books like Professing Feminism, sort of telling tales out of school, saying this is what goes on in these women's studies departments, right? It would bleed out into society, but we didn't hear about it. But the men's rights movement is laboring under working out its views and its ideas in the full light of the public on the internet, and it looks really bad sometimes. I find it tremendously off-putting. It's one of the reasons why I don't want to self-identify as a part of the men's rights movement, even though I am sympathetic to some of the issues that they raise. So I think with respect to sort of identifying the men's rights movement, associating it with a certain amount of craziness, I think that's well warranted because of what is actually there to be seen. But I sort of have to struggle with myself not to dismiss it just on that basis.
And if I may, there's a couple things I'd like to add too. On both sides, it is the people who feel the strongest who will. It is the people who feel the strongest who will speak the loudest. And unfortunately, feeling strong and being fully informed or fully thoughtful is not always the same thing. I think it was Sargon Akkad who gave me the phrase, the tyranny of the shrill minority. In any group, there's always going to be a statistical distribution, and where it's always at the extremes where the volume spikes are going to be loudest. And so we human beings always go for the loud noises. Meanwhile, the men's rights movement, at least for the last 20 years, has been going on, and it's been very, very quiet. No one paid attention. It's like if I brought it up in polite conversation, people would just go, yeah, man up, and then change the subject. It is only until, and I know that AVFM has a reputation for being extremely loud, extremely vocal, but it is AVFM who really, because they were shrill, because they were loud, because they were vocal, and basically they were giving everyone the finger, that people, their emotions got engaged. And it is then that they started listening. Now, they still serve that purpose, and there is space for those of us who don't have that necessity to beat someone with arguments and who can discuss and who are willing to be reasonable. We now have a space to speak that we didn't have before. 20 years ago, I talked about this stuff. Nobody listened. 20 years ago, when I looked for articles and magazines and books, and even at the beginning of the internet, you couldn't find anything on men's issues in general, unless it was to blame men for being, you know, the bad husband, the bad father, women who make foolish choices. Everything was pro-woman, anti-man. Now, finally, yes, we've got our crazies, but that's the price you pay for that's the price you pay at the beginning of a movement. I'm sure if we take any political movement, whether capitalism, communism, you name the movement, they started off with a shrill, loud people. Now we have a circumstance where we've got loud, shrill people. As Ozzy points out, it is unfair to point to any movement and say, well, we want to avoid conflict. We don't want the crazies getting on board. You know, that'd be like my comparing all the women's rights movement to Tumblr.
I didn't say that. I mean, obviously I acknowledge that there's always going to be crazies, but there's also something to be said by having an ideology that makes that less likely. And all I'm doing is questioning the fact that in this climate, a more humanist-based movement might be less likely to attract the crazies. It seems that the men's rights movement is always going to have the certain reactionary element to it, so the men's rights versus the feminists, and this is something that you see a lot. You see the feminist blames the men's rights activists, the men's rights activists blame the feminists, etc. And there's a study that suggests that if you have a viewpoint that's opposed to another viewpoint, your own viewpoint becomes more extreme simply as an artifact of being opposed to the original viewpoint. This is a fact. I mean, this is something that you see a lot in the GMO debate. GMOs are fantastic, incidentally. They're a good idea. But what you get often at the time is when you get a load of anti-GM nonsense, the sensible pro-GM people tend to become even more extreme, saying that there's no possible, there can't possibly be anything against GMOs ever. Again, there's nothing wrong with GMOs; they're fine. But the position becomes more extreme, just as an artifact of being reactionary to a bullshit movement.
I have a question for you. Why is it bad to have extremists?
What? Okay, so I just didn't hear that. Can you repeat the question?
If I understand your argument, what you're trying to say is extremism is bad. We should engage in activities that does not breed extremism. Okay? Why is extremism in anything bad?
Well, to go along with the point that Ozzy was bringing up there earlier, is the extreme views is what keeps me out of even addressing this topic most of the time. Is like he was saying, is that the only part of these arguments that I observe is the stuff that's coming from the extreme ends. I don't see the moderate people at work. All I see is like the castrate all men day, or the men coming out and blaming all the plights of men on women. Like that's what I see.
Okay.
But Francis's question is, what's wrong with extremism, right? So Xbox, or rather, Sahi, you and I agree that we find this extremism off-putting, but his point is, well, what's wrong with it, right? What exactly is wrong with the extremism? Well, my answer to that would be, they make false claims. Their diagnosis of the situation, of the problem, is incorrect, and consequently the policy recommendations that they put forward are ill-conceived. I can't get behind that. In fact, not only do I not want to get behind it, I want to oppose it. I want to oppose it as another species of irrationality. I'm not more impressed with irrationality when it's coming from the men's movement than I am when it's coming out of the mouth of a feminist. So that would be my answer to what's wrong with extremism.
I think there's a more relevant answer to specifically to Francis's question that's better suited for this. I think the more relevant answer is that people generally start off in the middle and then make the decision and move outwards. If you have a movement that's more likely to foster extremism, then you're going to push people away from that. So the enemy, potentially the biggest friend of feminism could be the men's rights activists, because they attract people towards it, because people are likely to go and see how crazy certain aspects of it are, and they're going to be drawn to the opposite side. Whereas a more moderate, not in the sense that I'm not necessarily saying that the men's right is inherently not moderate or inherently extreme, but a group that is less likely to attract the extremists is also less likely to suffer from this problem. There's less of a PR issue, and I know PR shouldn't be a problem, but in reality it is. And if we're trying to have a better society, then that should be something that we take into account.
Okay. There's first of all, I want to make clear that I'm not endorsing extremism. Okay. What I want by asking that question, what I wanted to do is I wanted to find out what your motivation, what presuppositions you were coming off of. So far, I've gotten two arguments. One, it turns me off. Two, they make false claims. Okay, so those are both valid concerns. But is that enough to say, well, we shouldn't allow anyone, first of all, as if we have the right to allow or not allow someone in, but these people should not exist because they have their own points of view that makes me feel icky or that are false.
No.
We don't have control.
You asked what was wrong with extremism.
Sorry,
You're answering a different question right now than the one you asked, and I wanted to bring up, this is a huge problem with extremism. It's not hard to look at something that somebody's put forward, their idea, and try to extrapolate from that how they'd like the world to be. Somebody mentioned policy decisions, and look at that and say, that would be a terrible way for things to be. I don't want things to look the way extremists want them to look. That's really dangerous. Why would you can't possibly want to support that.
Can I just make the point that this is not about sorry. Can I just make the point that this is not about free speech? I'm about as pro free speech as you could possibly get. I love free speech. This is not about free speech. I'm not saying extreme viewpoints should not be allowed to exist. That's not my point at all. What I'm saying is that if we want to tackle the issues associated with, for example, radical progressive feminism, then allowing a group that fosters extremist views is going to be counterproductive.
Allowing. What can you do about it?
That's just a language thing. Authoritarian censorship doesn't work anyway. It's not something that I'd ever suggest. All I'm saying is that if you want to solve this problem, there are potentially better ways of doing it. I'm not suggesting that anything like this should be banned. Please don't get me wrong on that. This is not about censorship. This is not about. This is not an anti-free speech argument. I'm very much pro-free speech. Just to be very clear on this.
Could I say something
go ahead,
about
Ozzy.
this? Because there is this concern about censorship and censoriousness within a movement. We don't want a sort of a repeat of something like atheism plus. There are some people there who have perhaps some lofty aims, but their approach was horrifically censorious, narrow-minded, exclusionary, insular. I mean, it was ill-conceived. But it seems to me that if you're going to have a men's rights movement, it needs to police its own. One of the things that feminism labors under now is the fact that there's all these crazy ideas out there. I mean, patriarchy theory, I think, is just a pile of twaddle, and there's just tons of nonsense within feminist theory, both in the form of how it diagnoses the problems and the policy recommendations that it makes to remedy the problems that it identifies. And I mean, if feminists sort of could have policed their own, could have seen to it that they marginalized by denouncing as bad ideas the ideas of Andrea Dworkin and Catherine McKinnon and that sort of thing. If they had done that, then I think feminism would not be a dirty word in the mouths of many people, including a lot of women. I mean, there's a lot of women who are very happy with what feminism and the women's rights movement has accomplished up to a certain point, but are put off by what they see as just craziness, overblown rhetoric, victim psychology, and the demonization of men. Right? It's just sort of the wheels have sort of gone in the wrong direction, and it's because people didn't, in the movement, the more sober elements just were happy to let the extremists have the day because they gin up interest, right? And I think that the men's rights movement has a particular problem here. It's the same problem that the feminists have, It's this PR problem, but it's worse for the men's movement. There is this bias, this tendency, and perhaps it's in our species, or perhaps it's just cultural. I don't want to beggar that question, but there is a tendency for people to be more concerned, to worry about the well-being of men. I think it is most
Of men?
men, yeah, of women. I'm sorry, men have a tendency to be concerned about women. We have ideas about gallantry and chivalry and stuff like that. Women and children first, and that sort of thing. That's sort of pickled into us, right? When a woman cries that she's a victim, people have a tendency to take it. When a man cries that he's a victim, especially of a woman, people have a tendency to think that he's just a big wussy and a whiner. The way we view complaints from men and women is very, very different. Whether that's something sort of biologically in us or culturally pickled in, it doesn't matter. The point is there is this difference. And so when women band together and identify a social evil or some social disadvantage that they're laboring under, people, I think, are more favorably disposed to listening than when men do that. And I think it's for that reason it's much more important that the men's movement get their facts straight, that they not engage in overblown rhetoric, that they don't say things that would allow people to easily dismiss them. I think it's especially important for the men's movement because they don't benefit from a habit of mind of feeling sympathetic towards men. Men are supposed to be tough. Men are supposed to take it on the chin. Men are supposed to be thick-skinned and broad-backed. They're not supposed to complain and whine about their lot in life. They're just supposed to do something about it. And because there is this cultural expectation of men, it's very important that the men's movement get its house in order. More so for the men's movement, I think, for this reason than for the women's movement.
So there's a couple of things, if I may, say to that. First of all, these days I spend far more time talking amongst my men's rights advocates, my fellow men's rights advocates, than I do feminists. I went through this phase of when I was working my arguments out, when I was trying to find ways of phrasing things, when I was looking for the subtle nuances that one can't necessarily find in a textbook, I engaged a lot of feminists. These days, I find myself engaging men's activists for the largest part, and those that I call the crazies are actually, in fact, a smaller faction that fall under one of two categories. Well, maybe three, but we'll go with two. One, it's the men who are immediately in pain. My wife just took me for everything that I have. I'm living in my car. I haven't seen my children in 3 years. I lost a job because a false allegation was made against me. There are men who are actively suffering the brunt of issues of the nature that only men will face, and they're angry here and now. We have to let these people speak at some point and just kind of let the rage flow out until it's finished. Unfortunately, as Ozzy says, it's done on the internet. It's very, very public. The second kind of people who do this are the people who don't realize that we're talking, in my opinion, and everything here is my opinion, but the second group of people are those who and this especially applies to younger men in their 20s who are all high on ideology of some kind. This thing makes sense to me, therefore it's the only thing that can be true. And I see this in people of all ages, but those are the two groups that I spend the most time with. The first group usually says, yeah, well, you haven't been screwed over the way that I'm screwed over. You're naive. You're an idiot. You don't know how the real world works. I just listen to these guys and let them do their things. The other ones, I spend a lot of my time correcting their ideas. All women are like this. Well, no, they're not. This is where we hear arguments of all women are hypergamous, therefore men are screwed for eternity. Women have no honor. There's not a single one of them who have honor at all. And I'll have these long arguments with these guys going, here's why what you're saying simply isn't true. And by the way, when you say these things, I don't tell them that they're misrepresenting us. I just correct the ideas one by one. If you go even on a Voice for Men's site, you'll find very frequently articles that say, the person who's putting forth these views is an idiot, and they'll put that in the title. So-and-so is an idiot. You find a lot of this, but again, what is catchy about that? What is emotionally engaging in this? People don't see it because it's not loud.
Why is the loudness or the shrillness have to be reserved to the extremists? If more people are in the position that they consider themselves more moderate, more reasonable towards this, if there's more people there, why don't those people up it up, and try to outshout them?
Because
Here I am.
Moderation promotes apathy, or apathy promotes moderation. Main issue with all this.
It's just a function of the human being. I think it's called the Overton window. I could be wrong about this, but there's a theory that groups always start off in extremes, and over time they kind of merge towards the center of the bell curve. We just happen to be, the men's movement happens to be there, but we're shifting over. Why don't we hear about more moderates? You're talking to one right now.
So, this is going back a bit, but it is also what you just said. I feel like having gender-specific movements is divisive in its very nature and is problematic in its very nature, and discourages that merging and discouraging that joining a group that you don't personally identify as. And I think that's problematic. And I don't know if somebody's laughing at me.
Well, it seems to me that I think one thing that I hear in the variety of ways that this comment has been presented is, we want to avoid conflict. Well, I can appreciate that you want peace, but peace has an upside and peace has a downside. Conflict has an upside, conflict has a downside. The question is not, is it polarizing or divisive? I think that, look, what we don't need is some bland, homogenous middle. What we need is for both sides to be heard clearly, but the moderates, not even the moderates, the thoughtful, the intelligent, the wise, the kind of both sides to be heard. It's not a marshmallow lump that we want, but two clear, distinct sides to be heard reasonably, intelligently, respectfully, and kindfully. That's what I would aim for. If that's what you're aiming for, I support that.
I'm not advocating moderation per se, so much as avoiding assholism or extremism. I'm not calling you an asshole. You missed the part where I said I was not a feminist, just so you know.
No.
I'm saying that having a men's movement and having a women's movement is divisive in its very nature. By definition, that's divisive. It uses identity politics to try to get its way, which is really annoying and not helpful and makes everybody look bad. And as was said earlier, that, I think, is what was suggested to breed extremism and really awful views and assholism.
If you can write assholism out of the genetic code, you'll win a Nobel Prize.
I'm not trying to eradicate it. I'm saying you've got a false starting point when your starting point props that up unnecessarily. It's not a necessary part of any civil rights movement to have a feature that breeds extremism or assholism. That's why egalitarianism doesn't have that kind of problem, or humanism doesn't have that kind of problem.
I think the main thing I'm trying to get across here is that we need a change of power tool, and what I see is that the feminists have a lot of control in the political sphere. Feminist politics is quite it's quite noteworthy in the political sphere. For instance, in the UK government, you never hear about men's rights issues in the UK government, and that's, I think, the same for the US and Canada. So my biggest concern at this point, I think the feminist ideology is quite dangerous in a sense that it promotes a divisive set of politics between men and women. There's all these kinds of anti-meritocratic views that it promotes. And my suggestion is that what's the best tool? In my opinion, I think that feminism is a problem that needs to be addressed within a rational way. And my main issue is that I don't think the men's rights movement is a tool that is well suited to that purpose, in the same way that it would be well suited to a purpose whereupon men did not have legal rights in a significant way, in the same way that women didn't have suffrage.
Can I ask you
I
to
think it's
rephrase
the
that?
wrong. I think it's the wrong tool because it comes across to any third party who doesn't look into this as being slightly hypocritical.
Who is the well? Who or what would be the right tool? Because I mean, before there was a men's rights movement, you know, we got these excesses of feminist theory that are uncoupled from reality, and look where we've landed up now, right? I mean, I think that, you know, feminism is suffering, is sort of fighting a PR battle now. Literally, they're trying to get celebrities to self-identify as feminists, right? Because they realize, oh, feminism is no longer sort of a yay word as it was for a short time there. There was a window there, you know, where, you know, you were bra burners and that was horrible, and then, but then, you know, suddenly feminism was the thing to be. Of course, you know, you want to be a feminist, right? Why would you not want to be a feminist? How could you be against women's equality, right? But something has changed, and now a lot of women, prominent women, don't want to be tarred with that label. And why don't they? Well, it's because they know that label out there is toxic, and they don't want it. And so feminism is working against it. So that just goes to show how things have gone a certain way. Who is going to sort of combat this sort of the toxic feminism that some people see, other than a countervailing movement, right? Now, it's not that I think that that's a good reason for it to have a extremism from the other side, but it seems to me that the moderates are not going to be the ones that balance things out.
But
For the reason that we said, the moderates have a tendency to be apathetic, right?
Can we take a recent example? I think one of the most effective movements against this is actually Gamergate. I mean, a lot of you might be familiar with Gamergate,
Yeah.
and the Your Shield project. I think that's been highly effectual against these sorts of politics. And if you look at Gamergate as a whole, Gamergate isn't it's not about men's rights, it's about ethics, and people associate with that much more. It seems that it's a far more effective movement, as is the Not Your Shield stuff. What I'm saying is that Gamergate has managed to achieve in a relatively short amount of time something that the men's rights activists didn't seem to be able to do so in the sort of same time period.
And without identity politics, I might add.
So I mean, and ironically, actually, Gamergate was started by someone that was arguably towards traditionalist views, but I don't know what the best tool is, but I think a tool more like Gamergate, a more friendly sort of something that emphasizes the egalitarian, not Your Shield. We're all about equal rights. We're about rewarding merit. We're not about causing gender wars. Would be more effective against the sort of stereotype breeding progressive politics that it's basically against.
There's a couple things I'd say to that. One, yes, you're right. Gamergate was very effective, and they had a very specific cause against very specific people. Ethics in game journalism. It was a limited engagement, but Gamergate was not a social movement. Remember that there's a difference between the men's movement in general and what we think of as men's rights activists. There are men's rights activists that you've probably never heard of. National Coalition for Men is an example. The Innocence Project tackles a lot of issues that affect men directly. They don't think of themselves as men's activists, or they just deal case per case per case. They're extremely valuable, but who here, other than those who are interested in the subject, have heard of these people? So this stuff is going on.
Could I just interrupt you, Francis? Could you just say a little bit about the Innocence Project and how something like that is a men's rights issue? I mean, I know why it is, but viewers won't necessarily know what jail sentences have to do with any of this.
The Innocence Project is not a men's rights movement project. It's not a feminist project. It is a project of people who said, you know what, there are a lot of people who are in jail falsely. They had bad lawyers, bad judges, the charges were there wasn't enough evidence. One thing that they will frequently do is they'll find a case that they think they can win, and they, for example, one thing that the Innocence Project will frequently do is they'll find a man who's accused of rape, and they'll do DNA tests, and they'll compare it to what did not exist in the day. Our DNA tests now are far better than they were in the 60s, the 70s, the 80s. And so they'll go, well, let's do this. Let's reevaluate it. And there are a lot of men who are in jail under false charges of rape, false charges of murder, false charges of this and that, and they manage to exonerate the innocent. Now, they also do this for women, by the way. Now, these are people who are helping. They are also helping women, but they're also helping men. They don't consider themselves activists. They're doing very specific work in a very specific domain, and they're doing it for free, by the way. I think of them, they're a little bit like the Electronic Frontier Foundation for the falsely convicted. I'm sorry, you were saying something? I didn't hear it.
Oh, I just said EFF. I was trying to help you out because it's a mouthful.
Yes.
Yeah. So just to sum up, or to sort of highlight the point that I was, why I was asking the question is, sentencing practices are so different between men and women. I mean, a man and a woman can commit the same crime. You can practically do this as a science experiment, and look how men are sentenced compared to women. I mean, sentences for men are much longer and much harsher.
60%.
Yeah, than for women. I don't know what the figures are now. I looked at them a long time ago. But and there happens to be. I remember looking at one study that didn't square with some of the numbers that were being repeated by some men's rights activists. This is again this problem that I see with sort of overblown statistics and rhetoric and stuff like that. But there is in fact a genuine problem there, and the problem is real enough that we don't need to, gin it up and exaggerate it. But it's a real problem, and this is a problem that affects men differentially, and that's why I think it does make sense to say, well, okay, yeah, this is not just an egalitarian issue. Of course, it's an egalitarian issue, but it's an issue that differentially affects men to their greater disadvantage than to women. Our sentencing practices are sexist and discriminatory, and men are languishing in prisons longer than need be, or else women are not languishing in prisons as long as they should be. You take your pick, but something's got to change there. That's a real issue.
Now, I'm not. If somebody challenges me to provide you the exact number and the exact reference to which statistic, I'll have a little bit of a problem with this. But essentially, what it boils down to is that men are stopped by the police more often. Men are than women. Men are arrested by the police more often than women. Men are charged more often by the police than women. When it goes, men go to trial more often, and when they are charged more often and longer, and the penalties are longer than women for the equivalent rates. We call this the sentencing gap, and this is one example. This is one issue that the men's movement does tackle, does speak to, does try to do something about. Working within the justice system is one of the most frustrating and unbelievably political and difficult part to it, because there's so much legal red tape, plausible deniability, behind the scenes conversations that go on that will never ever make it to a statistic, that will very rarely make it to a newspaper. Now, these things happen very, very frequently, but the world doesn't pay attention. So when you ask why a men's movement, well, a men's movement tackles men's issues. This is one of the issues that men have to face, the sentencing gap. Other issues that are very common is because we've been under a women-centered system for so long now, and feminism has promoted so many negative messages, has generated so many false statistics, has, I don't know if it's feminists or women. I'll say it's feminists, but they're incredibly politically astute and incredibly media aware and savvy. And so they manage to promote their message in a way that makes it into the newspapers, that makes it into all the relevant diffusion points, so that certain things just become culturally accepted without ever having truly been investigated. This is why you get cases where people go, well, uh, Dawkins did, I don't know if it was Dawkins, but somebody did a survey at some point of Christians and said, are you a Christian? And some large number came up. They followed it up with another one saying, do you believe in God? Do you believe that, you know, the basic tenets? And they, well, no, I don't believe that. Well, many of the people who refer to themselves as feminists these days, it's the same thing. They think that it means some form of egalitarianism. But if you ask them very specific questions, they don't. Yet the message is promoted that feminism means being good to women, and we're geared towards this, and it overshadows everything. So one of the reasons why the men's rights movement is necessary is that it's time that men's voices start having equal impact and equal diffusion, because we are half the population. So one would think, like in some ideal world, that we would hear both sides equally, and we don't. So this is one of the reasons. Now, yes, we've got our crazies to deal with. We got our people who make a lot of bad claims. But what I'm hoping is that if just some Joe like me comes on and talks to more people will realize, well, wait a minute. Well, maybe I'm a crazy. I don't know. I hope not. But I believe that one of the things that the crazies did is they gave permission to the moderates to speak up. They were kind of like the sharp end of the plow, if you want. And now that that ice has been broken, then we moderates can come along and sweep along on the side. And I think it's this kind of show that allows the moderates to have a wider voice.
So you address some of the issues there. We have one of the questions from the live chat here, and you kind of addressed part of this, but it's a two-part question. The first part is, what are the immediate goals of the men's rights movement, and is there an issue for the men's rights movement that is analogous to marriage equality for the gay rights movement?
Yeah, can you please repeat those two questions to me?
Sure, I'll start off with the first one here. What would you say are the immediate goals of the men's rights movement?
Well, the men's rights movement is a movement. It is not an organization. So everyone addresses the issues that affect them most deeply. For some people, you'll see a lot of fathers groups. To them, that's immediate. I haven't seen my children in 2 years. I'm being denied access to my children. For them, that's very immediate. In my case, what is very immediate, I think, my personal belief, my personal interest, is that one issue that would resolve so many other issues is addressing reproductive rights and fertility control for men. For me, this is immediate. This is where I put my energy in. For other people, it's simply being treated with dignity and culture. You'll find a lot of that. A lot of the angry people are angry at the messages put out about men. Don't be that guy. So they respond with, don't be that girl. They're cultural issues of men wanting to be treated with dignity and not being viewed as predators. So there is no one single linchpin. The movement is all these people working and talking about what affects them. And there was a second question.
Yeah, is there an issue for the men's rights movement that is analogous to marriage equality for the gay rights movement?
That's an interesting question. On one hand, one could say that marriage equality, because it involves men, is a men's issue, but I understand that it's actually, that overlooks the other half of women wanting to marry women. Is there an issue that's analogous? You know, I'll think of one as soon as we hang up.
All right.
I'm sure there are, but you know, when you're put on the spot, you don't have an instant answer. But
Does
I'll
there
think
need to
about
be
that.
one though? I mean, does there need to be one? Does there need to be one issue that sort of stands out above the rest? That is sort of the flagship issue that rally around. I don't think there needs to be. I mean, um, people were agitating for rights for homosexuals and equal treatment for homosexuals long before homosexuals ever thought, hey, you know, we should be able to marry. Let's agitate for that. I mean, that is something that's only been on the agenda for a couple of decades. I mean, you know, when I was growing up, that was unthinkable. You know.
And before that came up, first we had to accept that gay people were people. You know?
Yeah. So I
So
mean,
things
that's
go in phases.
yeah.
Do you think that there's any benefit to forming, like I said, like ideology, like a basic set of tenets that you could follow? You can call it like men's right plus or something like that, or
I'm not sure. I would say that
you link it in with other social issues.
no,
Okay.
no. That's one of the distinctions. The feminist theory is very specific. It's based on conflict theory, and it has two goals: one, the promotion of women's interest; two, the promotion of women's perspective. And the basic notion is that women are oppressed, and therefore equality for women. Whereas people in the men's movement simply go, we've got issues to deal with. Let's deal with them. There's no central body of knowledge that guides or directs a movement like a theory would or an ideology would. There are commonly repeated arguments, some of them very sound, some of them far from it. There are many arguments that are valid within a very circumspect scope, but when you tear them, when you bring it outside of that scope, they lose all relevance. And that's a major class of the kind of bad arguments that men in the men's movement make, is they'll take the argument of hypergamy, which is so frequently heard. Hypergamy is a woman's tendency to be attracted to males of higher status and to marry up, so to speak. Now, are women hypergamous? Absolutely. What is men's equivalent? We have the roving eye. We like having a variety of women. Does this necessarily mean, however, that a woman has these hypergamous instincts? Does not mean this is everything that a woman is, because there are also cultural checks and balances. You know, a woman can't just divorce her husband and go to the next and go to the next and go to the next ad infinitum in all of them. And many women just, you know, they feel that instinct, but it doesn't mean that they need to respond to it, just as many men will go, you know, I'd really like to get with that woman, but it doesn't mean that because they have that urge that they must absolutely do it, and they will do it uncontrollably in every case. That is an example of an argument that is foundationally sound, but that has a limited relevance. And I think when you talk about some of the crazy talk, this would be one example, and these are the kinds of conversation that I have with my fellow activists or advocates.
Could I briefly bring up a point that Ozzy was making earlier?
Yeah, absolutely.
Does this have to be sort of men's rights activist orientated with regards to things like the Innocence Project? Does this have to sort of be associated with it?
No.
And in relation to that, I want to particularly bring up one example, which I always find quite interesting, and I think this is part of the problem, that these things, like I say, I don't necessarily know the solutions, but I think this is part of the problem with it. Feminism is supposed to be about equal rights for women, right? But there's one legal issue that I can think of where women are legally disadvantaged compared to men, and this is the ability to walk in public bare-chested. And this is something I find really interesting, because not all feminists, but a lot of feminists are actually opposed to this, whereas you would kind of expect that they would be in favour of illegal treatment, but actually it's the complete. Well, I'm not all of them, of course. Of course, there was the Barbary, you know, there was all that, but a lot of feminists these days would actually be opposed to legislation to allow women to walk bare-chested, just as men can. So I think this sort of highlights part part of the issue I have with the toolkit, with this tool being used. Another issue that I want that's more specifically directed towards Francis is when you were talking about the men's rights, about these specific rights groups, which I agree with. In principle, they're doing a great job, although I don't necessarily think they have to be politicized in this way. You said the feminists are causing this, or I'm not sure if it's the feminists or if it's women, and you said something along that lines, and I think there's a very real issue that we need to decouple women from feminism, because this does not help. What you were saying made it more like a men versus women thing, and this is not the case. It's not men versus women. It's
Right.
one political ideology versus another political ideology, and one of the reasons that people are against the feminism label is it has feminine. It's going to be about a gender war. So all I'm saying is that maybe there are better ways to do it. I'm not saying I know what those better ways are, and I'm not saying I have a problem with things like the Innocence Project, unequal prison sentences. I'm in favour with all that. I'm just anyway. I've waffled on long enough now.
Actually, I'm sorry, I seem to be monopolizing this. I don't mean to. You guys have to kind of boot me out. But I do really want to respond to that. Point 2, the equation of women to feminism, I absolutely agree with you 100%. And that's why I said I don't know if it's women or feminism. One of the ways that feminism has pulled the hood over the public's face, or over the public's eyes, is to conflate women and the political ideology of feminism. They are not the same. And the more of us who get that, and the more frequently that notion is spread out, the happier I will be. The second issue, in Toronto, the whole thing, there are places in Canada where being bare-breasted for women is just fine. I lived in Canada when the municipal legislation said it's totally okay, and for 1 week you saw young perky-breasted women showing them off. After 1 week, you didn't have any more. And now, why do women? And this, by the way, is also how the vote played out in the earlier. Some women were very in favor of it, and a lot of women were not in favor of universal suffrage. So this is where we get into this gray area of, well, technically, yes, we should, but instinctively or culturally or personally, we're not comfortable with that. And on the women's side, I can't really speak to why women might think or feel this way. I know that in Toronto, it's quite permissible. You can do it. I've seen women standing butt naked in Kensington Market in front of a camera holding a microphone. And as I walked by, I couldn't help it. I saw a naked woman before me. I kind of looked at her, and she shot me the dirtiest glance. How dare you look at me just because I'm naked in public? So it is legal, but we also still have those weird cultural and instinctive things going. I would not know how to resolve this.
Just one little point of clarification. It's not just in Toronto. In 1991, a 19-year-old student named Gwen Jacobs, it was a sweltering hot day in university campus. She decided to just take off her top. She got arrested and charged, fined. She was charged with indecent exposure. She got a $75 fine or something like that. She appealed it, and eventually the Ontario Court of Appeals overturned it and ruled that women are province-wide allowed to walk around toplessly if they want. And as you said, there was a short little window there where there was a kind of celebratory reaction where mostly young women, university students, did this in a kind of show of support and solidarity. But I mean, women are not walking around toplessly. But there was a controversy. I remember that a lot of feminists said, "No, we don't want this. This is a right we don't want. We don't. This is where we don't want to be equal to men. We don't want that." There was a fear that if this happened, that there might be pressure for women to do this from men, which strikes me as hilarious. That pressure's already there, and it's not because it's illegal that women aren't doing it. It's people are just fairly naturally modest about that kind of thing in our culture. So nothing has changed despite the laws or in ordinary circumstances. There are parts of Toronto, for instance, where you can get away with a lot of stuff. There's a sort of I don't know. There's a kind of a weird atmosphere in some quarters within Toronto.
There are still some things that they still do some things like that in Toronto. They have like the naked bike thing yearly and
Yeah, that's
all
right.
those other
Yeah.
things. So they do hold, and as well. I mean, there's a huge Pride festival that they actually do in Toronto as well, where you see people take advantage of these laws as well, or the fact that it's not illegal to walk around naked. So I mean, it is exercised the rights sometimes, but yeah, not a regular thing. But we're kind of getting to the end of the time here. We're going to start up an after show on this as well because um, maybe to talk about a few more things. One of the issues that I want to kind of bring up, hopefully in the after show, is along the ideas of the attitudes that these groups have towards each other and some of the tactics that are being played out on things like Twitter and the internet towards either sides of these arguments. So hopefully people would like to tune into that if they want. The live chat thing we set up here, it's great. I'm glad to see people are using it. Unfortunately, it was a heck of a time getting it started before the show, and I might have to edit the beginning of this video because I'm pretty sure I was rambling for at least the first minute and a half of this while we're trying to get it to work. But thanks everybody for tuning in. We're just going to kind of go through here. If anybody wants to throw out kind of like a last remarks on the topic, then that'd be great. And yeah, so Xbox, are you back now? Probably not. Quantum. Do you have anything you want to say before we go off air?
Well, I can just see the sort of comments that are going to come through. So I just want to point out that I'm extremely pro freedom of speech because I know someone's going to misinterpret me on that. I'm also very pro GMO crops because someone's going to misinterpret me on that. It always happens. It always does. So. Yeah, it's been a really great show. Thanks for doing it. I've really enjoyed the discussion. I think just despite the fact that I spent a lot of time talking, and I apologise for that. I think Francis and I basically are in agreement on most things. It's just I guess a slight difference in opinion on the mechanisms.
Okay. Ozzy.
Well, yeah, I thought this was a really good conversation. Francis, just last Sunday, was on the Magic Sandwich Show. We were discussing the same subject there. And I'm glad that we continued this discussion. I think we touched on a lot of different things here than we did on that show. So if anyone's sort of hungry for more of this, you can watch the Magic Sandwich Show and hear more of Francis's thoughts and the discussion that we had about the same topic, the men's rights movement. But I thought this was actually a really good discussion. We sort of plumbed a lot of different things that we didn't on that other occasion. So thank you, Francis, for a good discussion. I hope that there will be more discussions sort of in the community about this topic. One of the things that I find most distressing about this topic is that there are people who are strident on both sides, and there are people who will take umbrage at the very fact that we had this hangout and we had this show devoted to this topic. There are people who will get their panties in a bunch at the very idea that we invited Francis here to talk about this. You know, they will say things like, "How could you give airtime to this person and give credence to this movement by having a discussion about it?" To those people, I say, "You're a censorious prick. We're here to talk, and there's only one way to sort out these issues. If all of this stuff is bullshit, there's only one way to find out about it, and that's to talk about it. It's not by burying it." And to those people who are of that disposition, you now know my mind on it. I certainly am never going to be shut up about this kind of topic, and I'm not a men's rights activist. Thanks.
All right. Ned, I know that you were having some mic troubles earlier. Do you have anything you want to add in before we leave?
Yeah, just to kind of piggyback on what Ozzy was saying, I think that in the same way that the more moderate of us get pigeonholed as, loving the other side too much and giving the other side too much anything in the atheist type arena, I think that it needs to go the same way in this. I think that someone who personally has experienced what happens when you go through a divorce in Texas, and just how skewed the courts are when it comes to children and hoops that a man has to jump through just to get any visitation, let alone joint custody. There are problems out there for men, but I think that if both sides can preface any of those issues by at least acknowledging, if not standing up and demanding, that there are problems on both sides, and it is more of a human rights issue than it is just a women's issue or a men's issue. That's when we can actually make some real progress. Not to diminish any of the specific problems that do occur with genders, but again, just make sure that both sides don't end up pitting against one another when we really should be working together.
All right, thank you very much, Ned. Mallory, thank you for joining us. This is your first time here. Um, any last words?
Well, thank you guys for having me. I know it was last minute. I definitely appreciate that you trusted me not to come on here and be a terrible person. I kind of want to add to what Ned said. It's really important to me personally, and hopefully to all people who would like things to be better, that we look at issues and ask whether or not we're playing a zero-sum game. And rights issues shouldn't be zero-sum. Granting marriage equality didn't take rights away from anyone. It merely gave or restored rights. And when you find an issue that's restorative in nature, that's a great issue, and everyone should be able to focus on that.
All right, thank you very much. Francis, I'm going to give you the last word on this one. Floyd?
Yeah, I just want to say, if we're going to try to achieve a more egalitarian society, we have to talk about these issues, bring up where there are inequalities, and bring them to the forefront. So, being quiet about it, not talking about it, is not going to make a better society. So, we need to have these discussions.
Great. And because I'm apparently, like Ozzy pointed out, I'm a terrible person for even giving you a platform. Francis, feel free to take it away and get the last word as well.
Thank you very much. So the first thing I want to do is, of course, to thank everyone for having me and for a really cool conversation. One of the things that I find that is very common in these kind of conversations, if you look through the comment sections, so many of them are acrimonious and hard. And Ozzy was pointing to the Magic Sandwich Show 111, and I was very pleased to see that the conversations were actually healthy, good conversations. And I think that when people are exposed to healthy, reasonable conversations amongst people who are genuinely conversing, genuinely discussing with each other, that a lot of the acrimony goes away. And to start off the after show, I would point out that while I agree, men's rights are human rights, women's rights are human rights, I think that there is something to be said for specialization. If you're going to fix the house, at some point you need to focus on the plumbing. You need to focus on one part of the plumbing. You need to focus on the electrical system, on the heating system. In order for the whole house to be whole, at some point someone must be to work on something specific. And this is why I don't believe it should just be washed off as a general humanist movement. And it is why I believe that the men's rights movement is needed, because we're specialists dealing in one part of the house, while other specialists are dealing with other part of the house. What we all have in common is that we want the house to be in shape and the people who live in it to be healthy and well.
All right. Thank you very much, Francis. Thank you, everybody, for coming out and discussing this tonight. This is one of those topics that I really wish I could contribute more to, but it was great just listening to this. I really appreciate everything that people gave towards this conversation tonight. A little bit of basic housekeeping stuff for Deeper Than Dogma. Next week we will be doing kind of like our, I guess you can say, last show of the season, because I will be moving after that, so I'm going to be out for probably about a month, so you guys won't see me really around at that point in time. Xbox, if he wants, will be able to throw together some stuff if he desires so. But we will probably be back in end of August. Until then, any topics that people want to see us cover, feel free to send me a message on the Deeper Than Dogma account or my sock account here, and we will address them if we can. And again, everybody, I hope people enjoyed watching this. Thanks for watching it, and have yourselves a good night.